Boat Girl, a memoir of youth, love, and fiberglass. Melanie Neale. Fiberglass, Flesh and Bone, 1979, age 1. An airplane banked over St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico flat and green, spread out under my parents and me. It was 1979, and my mom held me in her belly. She was sick from her pregnancy and from the plane ride, but I felt healthy and rested and light inside her. We visited the Gulf Star sailboat factory. As soon as we got off the plane, my dad in cutoffs and a t-shirt, he'd left his suit and tie back in Virginia. My mom was granola healthy, skin like polished bronze, her baby belly leading the way. I couldn't see any of this, but I smelled raw fiberglass and uncured polyester resin, sharp and piney through the membranes in her skin. The factory workers stopped as we entered the building, glancing briefly at our family before either looking at the ground or resuming their work. My dad had come to make their lives hell. The boat had to be perfect. Dad had flown down before, entering the yard unannounced, checking to be sure that the hull was thick enough and the layout met his specifications. The workers, mostly retired carpenters and builders, must have resented him. He was half their age, a hotshot lawyer from the Tidewater area of Virginia, who represented the labor unions and had made enough money doing so that by his early 30s he was able to commission a brand new sailboat. My dad, tangled brown hair a little longer than most lawyers, wire-framed glasses sitting on his wide nose, the veins in his neck constantly pulsing as he gritted his teeth, always right and always ready to argue. The boat was Shea Now, hull number 20, with a modified cruising keel, heavy rudder, big Perkins diesel, Onan generator, sloop rigged, a slight stern overhang, and a heavy bowsprit. Inside, the forward cabin was to be the kids' room, and had a large fee berth and a hanging locker. There was a head across from the galley, and steps led up to a main saloon, with a big teak table in the center and a chart table and navigation station next to the companionway. Aft of the main salon, more steps led down into my parents' room, with a queen-size bed and another hanging locker and its own private head. I was born on August 7th, 1979. Somehow, knowing all this, I fell in love with the 47-foot fiberglass sailboat the day I came aboard from the hospital. 2 years passed, and I recognized my sister, Carolyn, the same way. I recognized Chenua. I saw her lined up with the other babies in the hospital in Newport News, Virginia, small and red and screaming, and I knew she was made of the same stuff as me, fiberglass, flesh and bone, made to my dad's specifications. She was the final building block of our family, the completion of what my dad had been working so hard to create. In the early days we sailed the Chesapeake Bay on the weekends, or whenever Dad had some time off. Work took him all over the country, and there was talk of a promising political career. But the time on the boat is all I remember. We trolled a fishing line and hooked bluefish, which Mom reeled in and pried from the hook with delicate fingers. Once a fish bit her thumb and held on so tight that Dad had to pull the bony mouth open with steel pliers. We glided up alongside the oyster boats that dredged the bay for the rough-shelled bivalves and loaded bucketfuls of them onto the stern of Neale. Dad set me up on a shelf behind the cockpit and opened the oysters with a dull knife, holding them so that his fingers gripped the edges as he slipped the knife between the two shells and pushed them gently apart. He cut the muscle that attached the creature to its shell and poured hot sauce from a glass bottle onto the trembling and wet meat. Some oysters went into a saltine cracker, but most went straight into his mouth or with just a dab of hot sauce. I ate them too, sucking them down even before I had a full set of teeth. You didn't need teeth to eat raw oysters. Mom sat at the helm with Carolyn, rested in a basket wedged between floating cushions, secure so that it wouldn't slide as we tacked up and down the bay, heeling as the gust came. When Monday came and Dad went back to work, Mom toted Carolyn and me to the sitter's house so that she could resume her teaching job. Both of my parents were trying to think of a way that they could make our weekend lifestyle permanent. Book 1, Migrations. Trade and Barter, Virginia, summer of '84, age 4. Grandmom Margaret helped my mom set up a picnic on the hood of my parents' blue Oldsmobile. Heat simmered off the dirt road, and the car and sweat pooled between my grandmother's breasts and soaked her tight t-shirt. Her breasts were brown and patchy with sun spots, and her fingers were long. I watched her unpack a cool stainless steel thermos and twist the lid off. She tilted her head back, and her throat moved as she drank. Then she lit a Virginia Slim and leaned back against the Oldsmobile. I wondered how she could touch the car without burning her skin. Perhaps the years and years of sun that she had and my grandfather had exposed themselves to while cruising the Bahamas had burnt the nerves of her skin to the point where she couldn't feel hot or cold. I sat on a blanket thrown over a patch of dry grass next to the car and marveled over her skin, and breathed in the sweet cigarette smoke. You didn't pack a martini lunch, did you? Mom picked up her mother's thermos and drank, frowned, and handed it back. It's afternoon. Grandmom Margaret checked her wrist where a watch would have been if she'd been wearing one. It's still too early for martinis. Mom turned the thermos upside down as if she were about to dump the contents into the red Virginia dirt, but the lid was screwed on tight. I thought you'd brought drinks for the kids. I did, she said. She grabbed 2 Diet Colas off the back seat of her Thunderbird, which was parked next to the Olds. The cans were warm and had silver flecks of dirt sticking to them. Mom shook her head, probably imagining how much caffeine and chemicals were inside the cans. She tossed them back into the Thunderbird. The girls will just have to wait until we get home to get something to drink, she said. I eyed the soda cans and ran a dry tongue over the roof of my mouth. Mom had brought along a bag of sesame seed and honey candy, and I unwrapped one and licked the honey off my fingers. It melted faster than I could eat it in the heat. Grandmom Margaret downed her martini and closed her eyes, leaning her head back so that sunlight spread across her face. She coughed and pulled another long cigarette from the pack in her purse. You and Tommy really going to go cruising? She asked my mom. Raise those kids on the boat. We're planning on it, Mom said. Why? Just watch the girls, she said. Boat life might not be good for them, might be a little rough. They're going to turn out to be completely unrefined. There are worse things in life than being unrefined, Mom said as she opened a Ziploc bag of carrot sticks and chewed one. Mom, Carolyn, and I watched Grandmom Margaret draw from the cigarette, sucking her cheekbones in until they were hollow and skeletal. I pictured myself smoking Virginia Slims when I got older. "I raised you okay, didn't I?" she said once she exhaled. We all turned to watch my dad and granddad crunch through the brush nest next to the road. Dad carried a machete. They'd been surveying the piece of waterfront land my parents had just bought, right next to my grandparents'. Their plan was to build a dock on the land and keep Chinois there during the summers when our family returned from the Bahamas. The Wittigs, who were my mother's parents, did the same thing. They kept their small cruising trawler docked at a rickety pier stretching into a creek off the Corotomon River. They were slowly building a house on the land, doing all the work themselves. During the summers they worked on their house and on the boat and gardened and hosted their 5 daughters and all the grandkids that came from having 5 daughters on their little slice of Virginia waterfront. In the fall, they untied their dock lines and headed south on the Intercoastal Waterway, a series of rivers and canals and creeks and estuaries that run from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way down to the tip of Florida, and then continued back up Florida's west coast. They crossed the Gulf Stream from Miami or Fort Lauderdale, depending on the weather, and spent several months in the Bahamas. My grandmother had beautiful shells in her house and on her boat, which she said she had collected during hours of walking the Bahamian beaches at low tide. "We waited until we retired to do it," Grandmom Margaret said, exhaling as she spoke. "You mean until Dad retired," Mom said. "I had plenty of work to do raising 5 kids. Mom was the oldest of the 5. She and her sisters had been raised in Portsmouth, Virginia. They lived adjacent to her father's veterinary practice, and she helped her father out in the office, tending to customers and caring for the animals that they boarded. She also took care of her sisters. She cooked for them on the occasional nights when her mother didn't feel like cooking. Tuna casseroles, Ritz crackers, saltines, and milk. During the summers, Dr. Dog, as everyone called my grandfather, would take a few weeks off, and the family would cruise the Chesapeake Bay aboard their trawler, the Seven Wits. The Wittig girls wore bikinis and flirted with the boys at the marinas. They swam in the muddy brown water of the Chesapeake, careful to avoid jellyfish, and lay out in the sun until their skin was copper and their hair was bright blonde. My mom varnished the boat's mahogany and scrubbed the decks, keeping it beautiful and ship-shape. The Wittig girls all went to college to find husbands, and all succeeded. My mother met my father her senior year at Mary Washington College, where she studied fine art. He was lifeguarding at a private club in Richmond that my mother visited, with a sorority sister, and was a law student at the University of Richmond. He was handsome, confident, and came from a good family. He was a catch. He asked my mother out, and she agreed to a date. They were engaged a month after they met and married in 6 months. Over jugs of cheap wine in their small Richmond apartment, they would talk about their plans. They wanted to buy a boat and sail away, get away from the city and the rat race. They knew they needed money, so my dad worked hard in his law practice, and my mom taught high school art. They moved to Newport News, Virginia, which was a little bit closer to the water. They bought a small sailboat, a Tartan 27, and spent the weekends aboard, sailing in good and bad weather. Dad's law practice grew, and they bought another sailboat, a Gulf Star 41. This one was big enough and comfortable enough for both of them to stay aboard for long periods of time, but they still didn't think it was big enough for a family. They kept it docked behind the brick waterfront house, and they bought in a small town near Newport News. At the Annapolis Sailboat Show in '78, they stopped at the Gulf Star booth and picked up a brochure for the new Gulf Star 47. A cruising sailboat for the discriminating yachtsman who demands quality, comfort, and performance, the ad said. This is the boat my mom told my dad. With money that Dad had earned from a recent case, they put a down payment on Chez Nous at the show. This is the boat we've been waiting for, Mom told him. We can buy the boat now and go cruising as soon as we can afford it. In the meanwhile, we can move aboard. Grandmom Margaret had finished her pack of cigarettes and had her eyes half shut. She leaned against the hot metal of the Thunderbird. Just make sure you all are careful over there, she said. My mom played pat-a-cake with Caroline, who squealed and clapped. I pulled a small deer tick off my leg and flicked it into the grass. The property was alive with ticks and chiggers, and even though we'd all sprayed ourselves with off, we still had to be diligent. Grandmom Margaret continued, the worst of the drug smuggling is over, but there is still a lot of action in the Bahamas. If you get in with the wrong people, it could mean your boat gets seized, or worse. We don't plan on getting mixed up with those types of people, Mom said. You know what they say about plans, you just have to be careful, that's all. Careful of the weather, the sharks, getting sick. There are doctors over there, but you may not want to go to them. Your father's a vet, but people still call him all the time for medical advice when we are over there. You have to have something you're good at, something you can use to trade and barter. If you have medical skills, you can help someone out, and in return, maybe they can fix your engine or repair something on your boat. Trade and barter, it sounded so simple and so wonderful. I traded with Carolyn all the time. My half-finished cup of hot chocolate for her full one, convincing her that the marshmallows would make her sick, or my one cookie for her too. Mom seemed to like the idea too. She sat back and her eyes focused on something in the distance that didn't really exist. She looked like that when she was thinking. Her eyes drifted over our heads, and focused on anything that was convenient. A wall, a tree, a cloud. She did it a lot at the dinner table when my dad was talking and Carolyn and I were silently eating. It was a look of peace and focus, of concentrating on a dream and trying to connect it to the real world. Take plenty of supplies with you, Grandmom Margaret said. Things that are hard to get or that are expensive over there, like cigarettes or beer or candy. You can trade the Bahamians cigarettes for fresh fish or conch. We are going to catch all of our fish and conch, Mom said. The heat made me tired, and I lay down in the grass and folded my hands beneath my head. I drifted off to the Bahamas, where I was sure we would find tropical beaches lined with palm trees and strewn with colorful shells, pink conch shells, majestic tritons, cream-colored cowries. I would gather them and make jewelry out of them, hanging long shell necklaces around my neck. Maybe I would trade my jewelry for something more useful. I wondered what the Bahamians would have that I would want. Northerly, Virginia, Fall, 1984, age 5. I don't know if it's such a good idea to bring the guns with us, Mom said. We sat around the teak table in the boat's saloon. The October wind from a strong northerly whipping the main halyard against the mast. Mom stood to clear dinner from the table as Dad cleaned one of his guns. Carolyn had her head to the base of the mast, listening to the thwacking sound from the halyard vibrate down through the aluminum where the mast came through the deck and into the cabin. She cried when I told her the sound was really a ghost trapped inside the mast, but she listened anyway. I've been doing some research, Dad said. We just have to play by the rules, you know. Declare all your weapons when we check in with customs. Tell them how many bullets we have on board. Dad came from a long line of Virginia good old boys who thought you were irresponsible if you didn't own at least 2 guns for protecting your family. What happens if you don't? Mom fidgeted with the cassette player that sat up over the chart table. The Judy Collins tape had started squealing again. She pulled it out, and I watched as the thin ribbons of shiny tape streamed behind it, stuck in the player like the bubblegum I'd gotten stuck in my hair earlier that week. Mom groaned and wound them back into the tape, turning the wheels of the cassette with the eraser end of a number 2 pencil. I hoped the tape wasn't shot, because I liked listening to Judy Collins. They can't confiscate your boat. Dad ran an oily rag over his rifle until I could see my reflection in the middle from all the way across the cabin. I just wish there was a better way, Mom said. We are going down there to get the kids away from guns and violence. She sighed as she popped Judy Collins back into the tape deck, and I climbed onto the chair at the chart table and leaned my head toward the speakers so I could hear it a little better. Look, Mel, Dad said. Did you know that there are still pirates out there? Mom didn't say anything. She knew he was right. She had read all the books. And magazines on cruising the islands, and knew that it was prudent to have a way of protecting your family from the many things that could go wrong. Pirates, Dad continued, they just drive go-fast boats instead of sailing ships, and they smuggle cocaine instead of gold coins. Now you're going to scare the kids, Mom said. I thought about it. Pirates. I hoped we'd run into some greasy, long-haired guy with an eye patch and a macaw who'd take a liking to me and kidnap me on his pirate ship. I'd be good at being a pirate, even though I was only 5. I was a fast learner. Judy Collins sang, Someday soon, I'm going with him, someday soon. They can't be ignorant of what the real world is like, Dad said. There are lots of bad people out there. He always said he knew a lot about bad people because he'd been a lawyer for more than 10 years and he'd seen a lot of them. He liked to tell us about the time he'd had to defend a serial killer. It was a court-appointed case. He said the serial killer had been sitting there in the courtroom eyeing a member of the jury who fit the profile of the type that the killer preferred. The killer had salivated and smacked his lips and had not been shy about his desires. We were never sure whether this story was made up. Bad people were kind of like mean dogs, Dad said. They could look cute and trustworthy, but then could turn and bite your hand. You had to be careful and approach everyone with caution. There are plenty of good people out there, too. Mom liked to tell him. Like you, Mom believed in him wholeheartedly and in the idealism that had guided him to practicing law. Dad returned his guns to the padlocked cabinet he'd had custom built for them in the stern. Mom pulled Carolyn away from the mast, holding her by the waist. I want to hear the ghosts. Carolyn clung to the mast with both hands. There aren't any ghosts, Mom said. Melanie said there were. Carolyn's eyes widened as the halyard banged extra hard against the mast outside, and the whole boat shook with a gust of wind. Carolyn, that's the wind, Mom said. Carolyn started to cry, so Mom took her up to the V-berth to put her to bed. Dad and I sat in the main cabin, me at the chart table and Dad on the settee, scraping the grease out from under his fingernails. The wind howled like a pack of hounds running down the Chesapeake Bay. It's time to head south, Melanie, Dad said. That wind's getting a little too cold. I've been in the Chesapeake for too many winters now. Are you ready? Yeah, I said. I was tired of sitting at the dock in Virginia, looking at the same marsh every day. I'd seen a muskrat earlier that afternoon, ducking into a hole under the crumbling dock down at the north end of Narrows Marina. Dad had told me that it was probably hiding from the cold. Narrows was a run-down marina that sat precariously between 2 rivers on the Chesapeake Bay. There was a playground with a jungle gym covered in chipped paint and squeaky swings, and a sandbox, and big pine trees that shook in the fall when the cold front started coming through. My parents had bought the property off the Corotomon River next to the Whittigs, but we were staying in the marina until our dock was finished. "When are we leaving?" I asked. "Soon as your mom's ready, and soon as your grandparents will let us go," he said. The Neale grandparents were protesting, saying that Carolyn and I were going to be malnourished if Mom and Dad went through with their insane plan. June, who was my dad's mother, had a hard enough time with the fact that Mom made us eat whole wheat bread and sesame seed candy. "I'm ready," I said, even though I was tired and wanted to follow my sister up to the V-berth. Dad leaned his head back on the settee, and we both listened to the wind, sharing the knowledge that there really were ghosts in it, just like there really were bad people and pirates out there in the rest of the world. The mast shook again, the wind vibrating through the boat and under me until I felt it moving up through the soles of my feet. A chill ran the length of my spine, and my arm hairs stood on end, the way you're supposed to feel when someone walks over your grave. There was something alive in the wind. It sent waves of electricity through the boat's fiberglass and teak and the big Perkins engine. "You're taking me someplace completely new, aren't you?" I thought. I closed my eyes and felt Chez Nous shudder under my feet. Grandma June called us a week before we planned to head south and told Dad that we couldn't leave. "I'm afraid your father might be close to having a heart attack," she said. "He'd had his first bypass surgery right before I was born, and lived with the constant fear that his heart would simply stop working." "How is he feeling?" Dad asked. "Well, he is feeling fine, but I just know that he is going to get sick again." "We are still going south," Dad said, "but we'll spend a few days with you and CT before we leave." CT stood for Carol Thomas Jr. Dad was Carol Thomas III. CT had a huge belly, and he drank lots of bourbon. He was bald and always joked about needing to get his hair cut. My dad referred to him by his initials and not by Dad or Father, which I always thought was a little strange, but it was just the way things were, so I didn't question it too much. We docked the boat on the Pamunkey River in West Point, a small and sobering town outside of Richmond. It was where my dad had grown up, a town with a paper mill and train tracks that cut along the river. It had a quaint downtown, 2 independent grocery stores, and was supported by the paper mill. Dad's childhood had been spent exploring the marsh of the 2 rivers that met there, the Pamunkey and the Mattapony. Together they merged into the York River. He said that he was unpopular in school because he had the right answers when the teacher asked, and because he was skinny, so he disappeared sometimes for days in one of his skiffs. The water was much more of a home to him than the house that he shared with his parents and his 2 younger brothers. "You know, you can move off the boat and stay with me," Grandmom June said, as soon as Carolyn and I were in the house with her and Mom and Dad were out of earshot. I sat on the floor, legs splayed out on the stain-proof carpet. She'd fixed me a big bowl of vanilla ice cream with butterscotch sauce, and I swirled my spoon around in the caramel sea. "You can go to a regular school and be around other kids. You don't want to be over there in the Bahamas. Did you know that everyone is black over there?" Grandmom June wrinkled her nose, and with a white and delicate hand pushed a carefully set curl back over her ear. She had a black housekeeper who came in once a week and vacuumed and cleaned the large house. She also had been one of the first white citizens of West Point, Virginia, to stand up for integration in the local schools. Her house had 2 stories, large rooms, and antique furniture, and she baked cakes and hid the insulin vials that she had to administer herself to treat her diabetes. Seeing the tiny needle prick her plump finger fascinated me, and made my grandfather cringe and look away. A gust of cold air came in through the sliding glass door as my mom stepped inside. Grandmom June looked at her briefly, narrowing her eyes, and continued talking to me. "Do you really want to spend all your time playing with those little black kids?" I don't know. I didn't know what she was trying to say. I didn't see much of a difference. Kids were kids, black or white. They all seemed pretty annoying to me. "June, what are you trying to tell her?" Mom took my ice cream bowl away before I could finish it, whisking it under Grandmom's nose. "I'm just telling her that if she doesn't like the boat, she can live here," Grandmom said, and let her finish her ice cream for goodness sake. "She doesn't need ice cream, she'll get fat. And she'll starve to death on that godforsaken boat. Where is she going to go to the doctor? What if she gets some kind of tropical disease?" Grandmom June, who was normally gentle and soft-spoken, was becoming hysterical. She paced the house's big kitchen, circling faster with each round. Years later, when she was admitted to the hospital to have a mass removed from her brain, we would all look back and wonder how much her personality at times had been affected by the disease that was growing underneath her perfectly styled curls. I wanted to tell her that it would be okay if I got sick, because there were doctors over there on boats, like Dr. Dog, with whom you could trade and barter for their service. Just relax. Tom and I have thought about all of that. We have tons of medical supplies on the boat and lots of medical books. When Mom took Carolyn and me by the hand and led us out the door, I thought about staying. The Neale grandparents always had good food around the house, and they let me spend the whole day in front of the TV eating ice cream. For the next 2 days, I agonized over whether to leave on the boat or stay in West Point. It would be like running away, kind of glamorous. Granddad and my dad celebrated our pending adventure with a bottle of wild turkey. They drank it on the rocks and paced together in the backyard, my dad waving his arms and my grandfather's jowls flashing from stern to set to smiling and back to stern. They discussed mysterious things that had to be discussed away from the rest of the family, and my mom and my grandmother and my sister and I watched them through the tall sliding glass doors of the Neale grandparents' house and wondered what the conversation was about. We left early the next morning before I could make up my mind about whether I wanted to stay in West Point. I watched the fog rise off the Chesapeake Bay as we plowed through the brown water on our way south. Higher in the Gulf Stream, the East Coast and Bahamas, fall and winter 84 through 85. Age 5. It takes about 16 hours to drive from Virginia to South Florida on I-95. When you're on a cruising sailboat traveling at about 7 nautical miles per hour, it can take a month. The first year we went south, it snowed in North Carolina, and the decks of our sailboat were dusted with white. Carolyn and I made snowballs and threw them into the brown water, where they steamed as they melted. We passed through the bridges, bascule bridges, swing bridges, fixed bridges, concrete and metal structures that stretched across uninhabited water, and marked the only trace of civilization we'd seen all day. Eventually, we'd been making the trip back and forth on the Intracoastal Waterway for several years. The bridge tenders started to recognize us. "It's about time y'all passed through here," they said. I wanted to be a bridge tender so I could sit and look at all the boats that passed through. The Whittigs had gone south ahead of us on their trawler, and they were already over in the Bahamas by the time we left Virginia. "If you leave now, you can travel with us, and we can show you where to go," Dr. Dog had told my dad. But we waited because everything on the boat had to be perfect, and because my dad's parents were trying to talk us out of going. "Well, do it safe. Maybe we'll do it the safe way the first trip," my dad had told them. We'll stay inshore on the Intracoastal, where we'll always be in sight of land and in VHF range of the Coast Guard. The VHF was a short-range radio that people on boats used to communicate with each other, the nautical equivalent of the trucker's CB. The palm trees started in South Carolina, scraggly silver palmettos that spiked the banks of the waterway. The weather turned warm around Fort Pierce, Florida, where taller palms of different pedigrees lined the shore, and the water turned bluer than I'd ever seen it. We started shedding layers of clothing, exposing white limbs to the tropical sun. It felt like we were awakening and unfurling, our skin prickling with heat and excitement. Fort Lauderdale and Miami were everything I had imagined they would be. Colorful cities where speedboats whipped past our lumbering sailboat and skyscrapers reached towards the clouds. Anchored in Biscayne Bay, our last stop before crossing the Gulf Stream, we could see the Miami skyline, lit with neon colors spreading out behind us. I thought it was beautiful. Look at all that craziness, my dad said. All those people stuck in the city, they have no idea what life is really about. He sat in the cockpit and drank bourbon from a Tervis tumbler. Miami is an awful place, he said, moving his gaze from the skyline to me. Why? Too many people crammed into too little space. Bad things, crime and drugs. He shifted his gaze again, this time to the blackness that spread out in front of us. A few flashing markers and lights from fishing boats sparkled in the darkness of Biscayne Bay, but for the most part it was black. The wind here was warm, and I liked the way it ruffled my bangs and the way it smelled like flowers. I would learn later that the oleander it smelled like was highly poisonous. Out there, my dad said, pointing into the blackness, is where we are going. You're going to like it much better than Miami. I sat and sipped a glass of water and stared at the Miami skyline, wondering what it would be like to be in the middle of all those lights. I woke up the next morning with a stomach flu. My dad tried to figure out where I had gotten it. He decided that I had probably picked it up from the grocery store in Miami, where we had done our last-minute provisioning. Damn it, I should have known better than to take them ashore in Miami, he said, pacing back and forth in Chez Nous' small main saloon, while I perspired in the forward cabin, leaning over the V-berth every now and then to throw up in a large steel mixing bowl that my mom had placed on the floor next to my bed for that reason. The marine weather was being forecast over the VHF radio, and my dad scribbled notes on a legal pad as he listened to it. The voice from the National Weather Center was computerized, and it reminded me of the words that came from the Speak and Learn toy that my Neale grandparents had purchased for my sister and me. Waves inshore 2 to 3 feet and higher in the Gulf Stream, the computer voice said. My dad wrote it down. We stayed at anchor in Biscayne Bay for another day, waiting for my fever to go down, but we couldn't wait too long because, according to my dad, we had a weather window. We didn't know how long the window was going to stay open. Other boats left ahead of us, heading for the Bahamas, their crew calling out to each other on the VHF, excited to be heading into the Gulf Stream. On the day after my temperature returned to normal, I woke up to the sound of the diesel engine and the anchor chain as it clanked into the anchor locker at the foot of my bed. My dad stood on the deck right above me, shouting back to Mom, who was at the helm, to motor up on it and stop. He operated the electric windlass, which pulled the chain across its cogs and dumped it into the locker. I could smell the seawater and bits of seaweed that clung to the chain, a rich and heavy smell. When the anchor was up, it made a loud bumping sound as it nested securely into its spot in the bowsprit, and my dad's feet thumped on the deck above me as he moved to fasten the chain in place. The hatch above my bed was open, and the same wind I smelled before, heavy with flowers, blew in through my room. Carolyn must have been up in the cockpit because the berth next to mine was empty. Chenille moved smoothly through the water, and I could hear the splashing of our wake as water slipped past the hull, only inches from where my head rested on the pillow. I closed my eyes and listened. The sound of the engine, the vibration of the boat moving through the water, the splashing, and the wind. All of it combined made me sleepy and happy, and my stomach, which had been nauseous and unsettled, began to feel better. We began a graceful up and down motion, which meant that we were getting out into the open ocean. I drifted back to sleep. I was pulled from my sleep when we slammed into a large wave. It must have been several times bigger than the ones we'd been going through. I stared up at the hatch above me and saw blue sky 1 second and green foam the next, as water rolled over our bow and across the deck. In a solid stream it poured through the hatch and onto my bed. I sat upright and pulled my blankets around me, hoping to keep them from getting wet. We went over another wave, and more water poured through the hatch. I wondered if this meant that we were in the Gulf Stream. My mom came running up to the forward cabin. "Oh no," she said. "Oh shit, I forgot to close the hatch. I am sorry, Melanie." She pulled herself up onto Carolyn's berth and secured the latches that held down the hatch. Then she stepped down and looked at our beds. "Everything is soaked," she said. "Are we in the Gulf Stream?" I asked. "We must be." She smiled and went to work, stripping the sheets and blankets from our beds and rinsing them sparingly with fresh water in our shower and spreading them out in the cockpit to dry. I suddenly felt better and wanted to be upstairs with the rest of my family. In the cockpit, Carolyn huddled down on the deck with a beach towel wrapped around her and a bucket by her side. She had saltine crackers in one hand and a Coke in the other. She was seasick. She'd gotten seasick a few times before. I hoped that my mom had given her Dramamine. She looked at me, misery in her eyes, her honey blonde hair tangled across her face. Her hair was always tangled. She was wild even at 3. I felt bad for her. I sat up in the cockpit and stared out across the ocean, which was a deeper blue than I'd ever seen before, and then I realized that I couldn't see land anywhere. This was a first. I looked in front of us and looked behind us. Nothing, just the flat horizon and rolling blue swells. My dad sat at the helm, his oversized sunglasses resting on his big nose, and sunscreen smeared across his face, but not rubbed in. He looked ahead, intent on getting his family across safely. 2 days later, we were anchored off Chub Cay in the Bahamas. It was a small island with a marina where people stopped to clear customs or to use as a jumping-off point for deep-sea fishing in the tongue of the ocean, which was the deep stretch of water between Andros and New Providence. A small fleet of Bahamian fishing smacks had anchored nearby, from lines that were strung from bow to stern. Conch hung unevenly. Mom examined one of the smacks with her binoculars. The group of Bahamian men who stood in its cockpit staring back through the harsh sunlight with their bare and unshaded eyes. "It looks like they've hung the conch so that the bodies die and fall out of the shells," she said. Even from our distance of a few hundred yards, we could smell the putrid stench of death coming from the small boats. Dr. Dog and Grandmom Margaret had met us in Chub Cay on their way back from the Exuma Island chain. They confirmed that this was the purpose behind stringing up the conch. The fishermen would spend days fishing and conching on the Bahama banks before returning to Nassau to sell their catch to the restaurants and conch shells to tourists. At Chub, Dad, eager to try out his snorkeling and spearfishing gear in the clear Bahamian water, spent hours freediving around our boat. He stayed nearby as he had read to do in case a shark or barracuda showed up and he had to get out of the water quickly. We watched him from the deck of Chenoo, both nervous and thrilled to see him circle our boat and dive and hunt. Once we heard a splash as loud as a gunshot, and all three of us turned in the direction from which it had come, only to hear it again as a black manta ray with a 6-foot wingspan smacked down against the flat, calm water, sending spray into the air. The spray fell back to the water like cheap glitter. Mom cupped her hands over her mouth and yelled, "Tom, Tom." Dad raised his masked face from the water and spit the snorkel from his mouth. "There's a giant manta ray over there." Mom pointed in the direction where the ray had jumped. "Oh," Dad said, "they are harmless." He ducked back underwater and continued his hunting. A few minutes later he returned with a yellow and purple fish, wriggling on the end of his spear. He hoisted himself out of the water and placed the fish in a bucket, and we all watched it as Mom flipped through the waterproof fish book that we kept in the cockpit. "It's a queen triggerfish," Mom said. "It's pretty." I reached into the bucket and ran my finger along its glistening back. "Can you eat it?" Dad looked from the fish to Mom and back to the fish. "Edibility is excellent," Mom said, reading from the book. "The skin is tough, so they are hard to clean. It says that the Arawak Indians used to make shoes out of the skin." Carolyn, following my lead, stuck her finger into the bucket to touch the fish, but she was 3 and less cautious, and her finger landed near the fish's mouth. It chomped down, causing her to scream, and causing my mother to rush into the cabin for a Ziploc bag so that she could freeze the fish whole, with my sister's blood still smeared on its mouth. They wanted to save the fish so they could show it to a doctor if Carolyn got any kind of weird infection. Later, Dr. Dog looked at my sister's finger and determined that she would be just fine. I had told her that her finger was probably going to fall off, so she was relieved to get the news. "The Exumas are the best of the Bahamas," Dr. Dog told my dad that night as they examined charts together. "The water is clearer and it's the least crowded, and there are people there that we know that you can depend on if anything goes wrong." We ended up at Rat Cay in the Exumas. The harbor was tiny, and like many places where we stayed, we had to enter on a full moon, high tide. We must have spent the days doing schoolwork and spearfishing and looking for shells and working on the boat, but I don't remember much about the days. What I remember from Rat Cay is the nights. George and Joni lived on a small wooden sailboat called Gypsy. Dad didn't like the name of their boat, but I never understood why. George had a gray beard, and he carved faces and figures out of buttonwood, which was thick and smooth enough to pass as mahogany. He carved mermaids and old men with beards, which curved across the buttonwood in river-like patterns. Joni claimed to be blind. I can't see things, and I can see things most people can't," she told Mom on our second night there. "It's hard to explain. I know what's going to happen to people, and I can talk to people who aren't here anymore." Joni drank dark rum and George drank vodka. Both drank it straight from the bottle or from tall stainless steel glasses. They rarely drank anything else. Joni's skin was leathery, and she had a stout body and muddy eyes. "You don't believe me, do you?" she said to my mom. "I don't know," Mom said. "I don't disbelieve you." Joni used a walking stick to feel her way down the dock, but when she reached Gypsy, she dropped the stick and clambered onto the boat like she could see perfectly. George said she'd been on the boat so long that it was like a part of her body. There were many other people at Rat Cay, coming and going, but George and Joni were always there. My parents drank more than they usually did when we were there, and I think that may be one of the reasons we left and never went back. The harbor glassed over at night, smooth and black, and buttonwood smudge fires lit up the area around the dock. Carolyn and I spent most of the time in a hammock near the fires, watching the adults and listening to our parents. cassette deck playing Jimmy Buffett's one particular harbor album. Stars on the Water played over and over again, and the Bahama banks spread out west of us with millions of stars reflecting against the shallow black water. Thick smoke floated over the water from the fires. It wasn't familiar to me at the time, but as I grew older and learned to identify the heady smell of marijuana smoke, I always went back to Rat Cay in my memory, the human nights with their heavy smells and the adults coming and going and the constant fires. I don't believe that my parents ever smoked marijuana and don't know with absolute certainty that anybody at Rat Cay did, but a similar smell hung over the island and was a part of the nights at Rat Cay mangroves. If you go near them on a still day, have a smell that's startlingly like marijuana, earthy and natural and smooth. There were many times in the Bahamas when I didn't know which smell was which, mangroves or marijuana. It didn't matter, both were there and both belonged. Night after night we sat by the fires. People showed up with dolphin fish and grouper to grill, and we ate well. I decided that I wanted to marry someone with a gray beard, and that I wanted to live on a boat when I grew up. I fantasized about it, thinking constantly about what the boat would look like and where I would take it. I fantasized about living in a world just like Rat Cay, where people from different places came and gathered and contributed to the nightly meals with their day's catches and ship's store of rum. The adults got rowdy at Rat Cay and danced around the fires. One night, a wizened and gray-haired Bahamian woman who was staying on the island with her husband began to murmur and beat softly on her legs. She sat by a fire and bowed and raised her head, her voice growing louder as words spilled from her mouth. The words weren't the Bahamian pidgin that I'd come to recognize and understand. They were harsher and faster, one syllable crashing into the next in a jumble that you could almost see as it poured from her and spiraled into the night sky. "What is she saying?" I asked my dad, who had moved closer to where his small family sat huddled together. "She's talking to a family member," he said. A family member? It didn't make sense to me. She wasn't looking at anyone or addressing anyone directly. "Someone who just passed away," my mom said. The woman's chanting was palpable, and it made me want to stand up and dance and swing my narrow hips in circles. "Is she speaking in another language?" I asked. "It's called speaking in tongue," Dad said. This was something he had seen many times during his rural Virginia childhood, and something to which the mysterious island chanting could easily be related. "It reminds me of singing," I said, and I felt myself rising. My body had stopped fighting the urge to dance, and I stood in one place and undulated, feeling my small bones and small hips move to a rhythm that needed nothing more than the gentle sounds of the current rippling along the limestone rocks, the hum of mosquitoes, the crackling of the fires, and the woman's chanting to be composed. The woman leaned back, her hands on her knees, and her Adam's apple pulsed as she threw her head so far back that it didn't even look like it was connected to her body anymore. She leaned and leaned until she was lying on the hard ground, and her jumbled words continued to climb into the heavens. She writhed and keened, the pain in her voice striking me as divine. Joni sat at her side and held her hand, her eyes darting from the woman to me and back to the woman. I lifted my head as well, staring up and up and up into the black night, and feeling as if I could see the woman's words trailing upwards like the smoke. Thousands of stars quivered. Joni watched me, her eyes little and black, and I wondered how someone who was blind could pay such close attention. "You're grown up," she said to me, poking my leg with her walking stick. "What do you mean?" I rubbed my leg. It was cold where her stick had touched my skin. "You act like a little adult," she said. "You are too old for your own good." Oh, I wasn't sure what she meant, but I had a feeling of momentum, of things moving faster than I could control them, and of me being pulled along through some kind of rushing current that was going to be my life. There were lots of people and lots of places, and none of them felt like home. We left Rat K and never went back, possibly because it didn't mesh with my parents' ordered sense of the world, but the night sounds and smells stayed with me.